End of an era. Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez died on Tuesday after a prolonged battle with cancer. What does it mean for the future of the South American nation? And how will it change policies, if at all, in a post-Chavez era? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, sitting in for Mike Walter, and this is The Heat. He was one of the world's most controversial leaders, an outspoken leftist loved by many for standing up to the United States, but also accused by his critics of running Venezuela like a dictator. As Stephen Gibbs reports, love him or hate him, no one could ignore Hugo Chavez.
It was in the 1990s that the former paratrooper first came to the attention of Venezuelans. Leader of an unsuccessful coup in 1992, he transformed himself into a formidable politician. His revolutionary rhetoric and promises of profound economic and social reforms united the left behind him and gave him a power base from Venezuela's poor. He was inaugurated president in 1999 with a substantial majority. Soon he set about constitutional reform, extending presidential terms and guaranteeing representative power to Venezuela's indigenous people. He even renamed the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela after his hero, 19th century independence leader Simón Bolívar. Abroad, Chavez saw himself as a leader of a new Latin America, united in common purpose and in various degrees of opposition to the US. His closest alliance was with Cuba's Fidel Castro, whom he often described as a father figure. In a deal organized by the two men, Venezuela sent Cuba almost all the oil the country required. In return, Cuba sent Venezuela much-needed doctors. The arrangement helped secure Hugo Chavez's popularity amongst his country's poorest people and a second term of office. But not everyone has been happy under the president's rule. Venezuela's opposition saw President Chavez's constitutional reforms as increasingly autocratic. In 2002, violent clashes broke out in Caracas. During this turbulent period, a brief, unsuccessful coup was attempted against the president. He emerged only more determined and more radical. President Chavez always saw himself as an informal people's president. Every Sunday he would host a program called Allo Presidente. Featuring phone-ins and ad-lib speeches, it would sometimes run for hours. As his rule approached its third term in office, his criticism of the US administration became his trademark.
Ayer estuvo el diablo aquí. En este mismo lugar huele a azufre todavía.
Here at the United Nations, he famously claimed he could smell sulfur. The devil, he said, in the former President George W. Bush, had been at the podium before him. Relations with the Obama administration were only slightly more cordial. The two presidents met just once, here at an America's summit. The US continued to view the leader of oil-rich Venezuela as a threat to the stability of the region. Hugo Chavez hoped to rule for at least another decade. In October 2012, he was re-elected for a fourth term with a reduced but still substantial majority, defeating Enrique Capriles, a young candidate who'd united the long-divided Venezuelan opposition. Ultimately, it was cancer, not his political enemies, which defeated him. In December, he announced that the illness had returned and that he would require further surgery. Leaving for Cuba that last time, he seemed almost as confident as ever. "I'll be back," he said. Stephen Gibbs, CCTV.
Hugo Chavez's populist policies caused bitter divisions in Venezuela. His supporters praised his efforts to fight poverty. His opponents say he ruined the economy. To discuss that and more, I'm now joined by Miguel Tinker Salas, Professor of Latin American History at Pomona College in California. He's also author of the book the enduring legacy, oil, culture and society in Venezuela. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Hugo Chavez either inspired adoration among his supporters or deep hostility among his detractors. Why was he so divisive?
Well, I think if we go back to where Venezuela was in 1998, Venezuela had a national narrative as an export oil-producing country, very closely aligned with the U.S., that supported the U.S. during the Cold War. The U.S. viewed it as an exceptional democracy. The rise of Hugo Chavez breaks with that model, breaks with that narrative, because Venezuela also had 60% of poverty. It had people living under destitute conditions. And Chavez gave voice to those sectors in society. And Chavez began assuming policies of reclaiming the oil sector in Venezuela that had been nationalized in '76, but that still operated as a foreign conglomerate. He also began to incorporate sectors of society that had been excluded: women, those without land, students, Afro-Venezuelans, the indigenous, people of color. So he upended the traditional political arrangements that had governed Venezuela for the past 50 years. And in many ways, it's only imaginable that that would cause polarization in society.
Yet, after all these years that he's been the leader of Venezuela, there is still a great deal of poverty in Venezuela. There's still a great deal of underdevelopment in Venezuela. I mean, I was looking this morning at the New York Times, and it has a headline which says, "In the end, an awful manager." That is justified, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is justified. Poverty has been reduced from 60% to below 26%. Those who lived under destitute conditions have gone from 26% to less than 7%. Yes, there are issues in the economy, but those issues are associated with the rentier state. When the oil continues to be, as it always has been, the dominant sector of the economy, it creates distortions in the economy. That happened throughout most of the 20th century. Since 1936, Venezuela has been a net importer of food. It continues to be, although it is beginning to produce more. So obviously, there are distortions in the economy that have to do with its role as an oil-producing economy. But the reality is that in many ways, he's alleviated poverty. He's reestablished Venezuela's presence on the international stage. One need only look at all the information and the interviews and the attention that he's beginning to draw now in depth to understand the significance and the impact that he has had on Venezuela and on the continent, on Latin America, and on South-South relationships.
Well, his policies resonated with those who didn't have, the poor, those who were living in poverty, and that subsequently became his political base, didn't it?
Undoubtedly, the political base became not only those who lived under poverty, but those in the middle class who were disgruntled about their conditions, about the fact that the model that was operating in Venezuela, a two-party model, a pacted democracy that had excluded much of the population and that had created an artificial image of the country, didn't reflect the reality within the country. There were really two Venezuelas. The Venezuela that was associated with the oil economy and had the image of it being itself as an exporting country attached to the U.S., and the reality that most Venezuelans face on a daily life. And those two images of clash, those two narratives of clash, and Hugo Chavez represented in much of the aspirations of those who had been excluded from the national narrative.
If we could put some kind of measurement on what Venezuela has achieved under Hugo Chavez from the day he came into power until the day he died, how would you characterize that?
I think you can look at the economy. Venezuela today has now reclaimed its energy industry. It now has the most certified oil reserves in the world. It's the 8th largest gas producing country in the world. Much of that has been the result of reclaiming and renegotiating contracts that have been negotiated under very different power relationships. He has reduced poverty. He has incorporated under a participatory democracy many of the sectors that have been excluded. And he's placed Latin America on an international stage. Much of what he pronounced in 1999 was considered radical is today mainstream. Issues of foreign sovereignty, issues of economic sovereignty, of food sovereignty, and regional integration, because Latin America now has institutions like the UNASUR, the Union of South America, the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, the ALBA, Petrosur, by which it provides oil to Caribbean nations at long-term credit rates. And it's positioned itself within the international stage in ways that Venezuela never existed previously.
One of the first things he did was he moved to nationalize a number of the major industries in Venezuela. Was that a good move?
The first move was to renationalize the oil industry, which had begun to privatize. It had been nationalized in 1976. That allowed him to reclaim the industry, to renegotiate contracts, and to increase the government's revenue. And that money went into social policy with 60% increase in social policy. Other efforts were aimed at trying to eliminate the bottleneck in the agriculture and in the food-producing industry, and those were nationalized. Not all were successful. There were some that were and some that have not. Many others have been developed at a communal level, at a community level, and they have not had the same success, so that there has been an uneven record on that level. And you have a hybrid economy. Capital is still strong. Capitalist relations of production still continue to dominate most of the economy. At the same time, you have a hybrid model that he proposed as his socialism for the 21st century. Both are coexisting, and it's unclear how they will develop.
Talk to us a little bit about his efforts to distribute Venezuela's national wealth to everybody in the nation. He introduced those black cards, black for oil, of course, where people could draw money every month based on those cards.
The black cards actually weren't necessarily his policy. That was a policy of the opposition. What he proposed instead was social missions. Once reclaiming control of the oil industry in 2003 and 4, then much of that money was plowed back into the social missions. There was first an education mission, then a health mission to provide medical services to the population, much of which had never seen doctors. Education missions that eventually eradicated illiteracy. Efforts to increase and expand the base of students going to university, with 400,000 new students now going to universities. Programs for eye care, health care, food distribution, subsidized foods production. All of those have been key in reducing poverty, and we see that dramatically indicated by the World Bank, by the Economic Commission for Latin America from the UN, and from other world institutions that have now certified that poverty has been reduced significantly, as it's begun to be reduced in most of Latin America. There's been great strides in Latin America to reduce poverty in the last 10 years.
And the other thing that he did with oil wealth was he used it very skillfully to establish regional alliances in South America, in Latin America.
With the particular two cases are of Petrosur and Petrocaribe. Petrocaribe is essentially a plan to provide oil to countries like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Nicaragua, El Salvador, oil that can be purchased on long-term credit rates so that they don't have the onerous conditions of having to take loans from the World Bank or the IMF and having to repay them immediately. The other arrangement was to provide oil to U.S. communities for low-income people in Boston and New York to buy heating oil at reduced rates. The other one was Petrosur, by which countries like Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela actually began to coordinate energy policy and begin to speak and negotiate with one voice on questions of energy.
And as far as his own political strategy was concerned in Venezuela, I mean, one of the things that he championed and actually got pushed through was to terminate, at least bring an end to term limits in Venezuela.
The Constitution initially in 1999 allowed for 2 consecutive elections. That was placed before a ballot in 2007 and defeated, and subsequently brought as part of a major constitutional reform. Eventually it was brought back by popular petitions and also by the National Assembly, obviously with Chavez's support, and allowed to end term limits and allow for the consecutive re-election of all political offices. That actually had an impact for both the opposition and those who supported Chavez, because now, in the case of Capriles Radonsky, in Miranda, who is an opponent leader, they could actually also continue to run for office in their state governorships.
I want to look a little bit to the future right now. Are we going to see any major changes under a new Venezuelan leader? Look, at this, to all intents and purposes, it's probably going to be Nicolas Maduro once the elections have taken place.
The elections will take place in 30 days, and we'll have to see what the outcome is. But if Maduro wins, I think we'll see continuity. I think we'll see continuity with social policy, continuity with foreign relationships. But the reality is that without Chavez, much of the issues now are going to have to be through collective leadership. Maduro does not have the same charisma, the same connection with Venezuela's population. That is impossible to replicate. So on many levels, we're going to have to see institutions actually beginning to fill the void. We're going to have to see a collective elective leadership develop, and we're going to have to see a much more efficient government in dealing with cases of bureaucracy, of bottleneck in the economy, in bottlenecks in food distribution, and in corruption. Those are things that are still unresolved, and I don't think that they will be able to be swept under the rug in many cases, because you don't have the same charismatic leader as Hugo Chavez anymore. Maduro is a different kind of leader.
Do you think, with the passing of Chavez, that the relations with the United States will get better?
I think not in the short term. I think in the next 30 days, we're going to see a very hotly heated contested election. But I think after the 30 days and after the dust begins to clear, I think that there is a new opportunity that began actually in November when there was discussions between Washington and Caracas. I think that after the election, there will be an opportunity once again to renew conversations and to try to resolve differences. But those differences also are related to the fact that Washington has not been able to understand changes in Latin America. Washington does not have an ambassador in Caracas. It also doesn't have an ambassador in Ecuador or Bolivia, two other countries in Latin America that also are part of the increasing social movements and the left tide in Latin America. So I think it also requires Washington to comprehend that Latin America is no longer its backyard, that Latin America has changed fundamentally, and that no longer can simply be taken for granted.
Professor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for your time.
There was no love lost between Hugo Chavez and Washington. He referred to the U.S. as a violent invader, while his American critics dismissed him as a despot. Why was the relationship so antagonistic? And can both nations move forward after Chavez? We will talk to a former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela after the break.
BizAsia. Asia means business.
Welcome back. Hugo Chavez often talked about a global anti-imperialist alliance against Washington. He called George W. Bush the devil and dismissed Barack Obama as a clown. His American critics say Chavez was a power-hungry autocrat and a megalomaniac. But with Chavez gone, can both nations put their animosity behind them? Joining me now to discuss this from San Diego is Jeffrey Davida, who served as U.S. ambassador to Venezuela during the presidency of Bill Clinton. He was also an advisor to U.S. President Barack Obama during the Summit of the Americas in 2009. Thanks for appearing on the show. Let me ask you first, political and diplomatic relations between the United States and Venezuela have never been good under Hugo Chavez. How did it get to this situation?
Well, I think, and I don't want to sound defensive, but I think the making of the very negative relationship between Venezuela and the United States was a product of Hugo Chavez. He started out very negatively. Very shortly after he took over, there were horrible landslides, rainstorms in Venezuela. The United States offered assistance, as we often do, and he refused in a very negative and hostile manner. I don't think the United States, and I'm speaking both of President Bush, President Obama, I don't think either of them have been particularly hostile to Venezuela. I think the hostility has come northward from Venezuela, and I think it was an integral part of Hugo Chavez's ideology and the way he wanted to present himself internationally.
So you say Washington had nothing to do with the poor state of relations between Venezuela and the United States?
Well, I'm not going to be naive and say we had nothing to do, but I think the gentleman came to office with an animus against the United States. I think he turned that into a very important part of his mood of governing and how he projected himself internationally. I think there have been any number of attempts on the part of the United States, both under President Bush, under President Obama, to have a better relationship. But I don't think that that fit the plan of Hugo Chavez.
Would you say it would be fair to characterize, Hugo Chavez as being suspicious of United States intentions in Latin America, given the U.S. history in Latin America, toppling an elected government in Chile, its involvement in the Dominican Republic, its involvement in Grenada? Did he have reasons to be suspicious of the United States?
Well, look, if we go back into history, there are ways to justify any set of prejudices, whether you're talking about prejudices between France and Germany or Japan and China or what have you. The real issue is, what is the situation today and in the recent past? And the fact of the matter is that I do not think that Hugo Chavez had reason to believe that the United States was hostile to him. I think he was operating on the basis of an outdated ideology. And by the way, he was also operating within Venezuela on the basis of an outdated economic model. So again, I don't want to come across as being very naive. However, I do think that the hostility was one way in its direction.
One of the things that Hugo Chavez did was that he was able to use Venezuela's oil wealth to establish regional alliances in Latin America. Why did the U.S. see Chavez as a threat to stability in the region?
Well, he used his oil wealth principally to prop up the government of Cuba, replacing the Soviet Union. And today, Cuba receives more assistance from Venezuela than it did at the height of the relationship with the Soviet Union. Chavez has also sold oil at reduced rates to 17 other countries in the Caribbean and Central America. The United States has never objected to that. Nor do we see this as a threat in any way to the United States. Chavez has determined, or did determine, that he wanted to present himself as an anti-imperialist, anti-American spokesman. And there is a market in the world for that kind of rhetoric. Keep in mind, we remain the largest market for Venezuela's, in effect, its only export, which is oil. And probably we are the largest exporter to Venezuela of other products.
That's right. In that respect, it would appear that economic realism trumped any kind of ideological differences between the United States and Venezuela, or as you said earlier, an outdated ideology that Hugo Chavez may have subscribed to. I mean, the fact that economic links never ruptured. There are huge trade relations between the two countries.
No, they never ruptured. Chavez, I think, made a conscious policy and spoke openly of trying to reduce his dependence on the United States. And indeed, the amount of oil that comes into the United States from Venezuela has reached an 18-year low last year. And Venezuela has gone down in importance as an oil exporter to the United States. This is happening at a time, of course, when the United States is importing less oil generally.
How concerned was the United States over the relationship between Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Iran?
Well, I think it is a concern, and it's not just a concern of the United States. The United Nations has devised a series of sanctions against countries that maintain certain economic ties with Iran. The United States has, and other countries, have imposed those upon Venezuela. Again, I think it was part of Hugo Chavez's political DNA, his genetic code, that he wanted to associate with those countries that are seen as hostile to the United States. This was a conscious decision on his part. And once again, I think the United States responded very prudently.
Well, looking to the future, in certain respects, the United States, of course, anticipated Chavez's death. And Even as early as November last year, a State Department official went down to Venezuela and put out a feeler to the Vice President, Nicolas Maduro, saying that, look, we'd like to reinstate our ambassadors, we'd like to restore diplomatic relations. So where does it go to from here?
I think there will be a tendency, perhaps, on the part of those from Chavez's own political current to perhaps present themselves as even more committed to anti-Americanism than Chavez himself was in order to burnish their credentials. But my hope is that we'll have to see what happens in the election, what political force wins, and that I think whoever is the new government of Venezuela would find a welcome reception in Washington if they were willing to reach out.
You say it is up to Venezuela. I mean, you appear to put the entire onus on Venezuela. Should not the United States put forward some kind of good faith move to restore relations with the country?
I think the United States has acted in good faith. The United States did not kick out the ambassador of Venezuela until Chavez kicked out our ambassador. The United States, the president of the United States has not called the president of Venezuela a donkey or the devil. The United States has not acted in a hostile fashion toward Venezuela. I think we have acted in a very prudent fashion. It's like having a neighbor who acts inappropriately, but I think we have conducted ourselves in a very civil fashion, much more civil than Hugo Chavez. And as I say, this was clearly an element of Hugo Chavez's public persona, and whether the next leader of Venezuela wishes to maintain that or not, I think the U.S. will respond appropriately.
Okay, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Chavez was an avowed socialist. His own humble beginnings made him a big supporter of the underprivileged. Not only did he use Venezuela's substantial oil wealth to tackle poverty in Latin America, he even helped struggling families in a country he loved to hate, the United States. Emily Drew has that story.
In a small church in Maryland,
we are deeply grateful to President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela.
The 8th Citgo Venezuela heating oil program launched. Since 2005, the program has supplied 1.7 million poor Americans with heating oil, paid for by Citgo and the people of Venezuela. The program has aided homes, Native American tribes, and homeless shelters in 25 states. Tiara Frierson is one beneficiary.
The heating oil program not only helped me, but it helps a lot of other families that just aren't in shelters, that are having trouble with their utility bills and staying warm.
Like Tiara, most Americans who use oil heat are in the cold Northeast. On average, these homes will spend more than $2,000 US this winter. For some, that's more than a month's salary just to keep warm. The Citgo Venezuela program is controversial among American conservatives. The National Oil Company of Venezuela bought full control of Citgo in 1990 and is one of the biggest gas and oil players in the U.S. American program leaders say they're the only company to respond to the need for heat.
I have asked every single oil company in this country. I have asked every OPEC nation. I have asked everyone I could think of for help.
Some say Chavez was an enemy of the U.S. The poor who benefit say they don't care.
No. My main concern is the heating source.
Venezuelan leaders say the program reflects their company's principles.
The logical thing to do was actually to return to the community and to the poorest what it is has been a good moment for our company here.
Whatever the motives, leaders on both sides put international disputes aside.
It's bigger than that. It's so much bigger. You cannot have stability if you're freezing.
Emily Drew, CCTV, Maryland.
Hugo Chavez there, taking his particular brand of economic aid directly to the American people. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Please send us your questions, comments and suggestions to theheat@cctv-america.com. Once again, that's theheat@cctv-america.com. And if you missed any of our shows or to catch our programming online, you can log on to cctv-america.com. I'm Arnold Nider. Thanks for watching. Mike Walter will be back next week.